Hello and welcome to an episode of Unfiltered at the Water Cooler. My name is Melissa Evers, co-founder and head of ecosystem at Kreneon. I am just so excited to have Laksh Sampat with us today. Laksh, let's start a little bit on your background. And you just got back from an extended period of time in India, and I think you have some kind of current news on the ground, a sense of what's really happening in other parts of the world. So I'd love to hear your reflections on that before we dive into our questions for today.
Great, Melissa. Thanks for inviting me. From a background standpoint, ex-banker, ex-consultant in the clean tech space, been in the space in the energy, clean tech, water infrastructure space for last 16 plus years or so. Have worn many hats in this. Being on the sales side for the infrastructure projects, underwriting side, and then even on the utility side, helping them structure some of their bigger infrastructure projects. So, worn many hats in my career with them. Yeah, you're right. I was in India for an extended period of time. For some work, for some family affairs. One of the interesting things that came out in regards to Kreneon and in the water resources was amount of money that might go into the space of the water infrastructure, which was still now not being completely aware about or being viewed as a substantial resources, right? But considering all the things that is happening because of the climate change and the El Nino effect, you are starting to see a lot of the South Asian parts of the world, thinking about water as a critical resources and making investment in that resources. To so much so that some of the bigger investors in that part of the world, because of the data centers as well as because of some other issues with the water quality, trying to focus on how they can bring in more dollars or the more money towards these kind of investments. So very interesting to see in that part of the world those kind of investments flowing around.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned you've spent years in big banks like BNP Paribas and others, and managed huge portfolios, billion-dollar portfolios. So you've seen every kind of flavor of green finance and clean tech, and let's be honest with each other. Once in a while, there's a little marketing fluff in there. There's a little feel good and maybe a little less substance. So what about Crenion's device telemetry registry model made you say, "Oh my gosh, finally somebody's figured this out, how to make water bankable"?
Yeah, no, when the idea of Kreneon came around with the team, one of the things that started going in my head as a person who was reviewing some of these deals is, wait a minute, it's sort of like filling up the gap of underwriting prospect of how to think about the cash flows and how to measure those cash flows, because as you may think, project finance is non-recourse type of facilities, and they depend on a lot of the cash flows for their underwriting as well, right? The future cash flows. Thinking from a sustainable link financing and green financing instruments, you start seeing Canyon's ability to monitor, to measure, and to create a registry of these kind of outputs of water. There's sort of like help you to measure the KPIs that could be aligned with these kind of sustainable finances. So think of it as Renewable platform is helping with hardware, it's helping with the registry, and then sort of like giving that rich data analytics platform that creates like auditable trust, as well as a third party platform that could be used for structuring some of these kind of sustainable link facilities, which to me was, we didn't see that a lot in the water infrastructure, especially on the water infrastructure space, right? So to me, it was sort of like filling up a gap which I didn't see that existed before. I mean, we have seen that in the solar market. You had RECs and carbon credits coming around, voluntary, involuntary, but in the water space, we didn't see that happening, right? So to me, Canyon sort of like filled up a very niche gap that I thought was non-existing in the market.
Yeah, I it's very interesting. Your comment about that you didn't perceive this gap as existing, but it is a gap. And you come to this with a very nuanced view of this double lens between your experiences with deep engineering and then capital structuring and SPVs, etc. So I'm really curious, what is your perspective from where you sit, the brutal reality holding back all these dollars of water infrastructure capital from private enterprise flowing into water infrastructure? Why is it that there is this good for Kreneon, right? There is a gap and we're going to fill it. But why do you think it is that project financiers are missing that, and so therefore these water deals really struggle, and they struggle to get underwritten, and they struggle to get insured, right? Why do you think there is that dissonance?
Yeah, you brought up a good point on the engineering side, right? So even in my previous life in evaluating deals, I would consider technology as a backbone or a platform that sort of like drives some of the decisioning, depending on the maturity curve where they stand, right? In my former life, I used to always think money follows the technology, and not the other way around, right? So you're seeing everything that is happening in AI, everything is happening in the chip space, memory space. You're seeing money flowing into the right kind of technology, right? And then where I see Kreneon is from probably three pillar structure here. If you think about it, it is providing a very robust engineering solution or engineering architecture. It's providing a platform that still again non-existent, and then it's enabling a business process, right? So it's all coming together in terms of like how you at the end of the day you deploy the capital that goes towards the space. So that's how I see all the solutions coming together as a three-legged stool of engineering, of platform, and the process all coming together, right? And that enables at the end the dollar amount moving, or the dollar moving toward the infrastructure project. So that's how I conceptualize this idea to say, okay, how can this be successful, and where the demand can be generated.
Yeah, I think that business process piece is so important, and it's so often overlooked. When you look at how the renewable energy sector really expanded private investment, private capital, the role of those standardized contracts with a standardized registry and standardized instruments, and all of that standardization enabling much more efficient and effective business process, and therefore capital flow, was so critical. But I love your other two kind of pillars too, because that's how that's enabled, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yep.
So a lot of ESG investment has taken a beating over the last few years because it was reliant upon voluntary corporate sustainability pledges or governmental grants that when an election cycle changes administrations, things shift. Our core bet is that we don't need those types of engagements. Policy's great, as you've heard on some of our other Unfiltered at the Water Cooler talks. Policy is a really important point. Regulatory incentives are a really important part of the mix, but it's not necessary. So how do we convert those manufactured water into these standardized contracts? And as a financial architect like yourself, why is this model the only way we're actually going to unlock institutional debt and capital at scale?
Yeah, so the way I think about, there are two parts of the solutions to this, right? One is what kind of risk we are mitigating, right? Is it are you creating a TikTok kind of a solution where if it's not in the world can still move around, or the world will collapse, right? So
Mhm.
what we're trying to do is enable something which will help more investment flowing towards a very critical resource space, right? So, which is water, right? What we are seeing now is because of the data centers, investments, or data center architecture coming around. You're seeing a lot of, hearing about water being used, water table being depleted because of the data centers, right? So now, think of it as that kind of a architecture is helping a very critical resources, or very critical resource like water, where infrastructure investment needs to flow, right? So that's part of one solution. And then the other is, how do you enable these kind of investment to be structured in the right way, right? So
Mhm.
with a Kreneon solution, where you don't have the standardized contract, in the space, the most legacy world is where someone is producing X amount of water. You put a meter around there, and you say, okay, based on the seasonality or based on the output, this is what water is produced, and then you sort of like architect, how do you finance these kind of projects based on the risk solution, right? So that's where I think having something like Kreneon, whose architecture sort of like helps you. Important point is look at from a legacy standpoint, or look at like historical standpoint, to say what kind of output was produced in this area. What kind of pricing was done for the water. That sort of like helps in the space to have some form of a historical understanding, and then sort of like price your future as well, right?
Yeah.
So when you create some form of a standardized contract, it's important to understand where the historical pricing was, and then where how do you price that future as well, considering all the other risks that are, or what kind of premium do you put on the what this the resource which is being priced as part of the derivative, right? So that
Right.
sort of like the Cranian solution sort of like helps you to architect that kind of a contract, that ultimately sort of like when you take it to say, okay, how do you make it a bankable solution. You have a lot of these data behind the scene, and then you sort of like structure some of these cash flows, as well as model out these cash flows, which is from a risk standpoint much better from financial instrument standpoint, that you can structure in the future. So that's how
Yeah.
I think about like Kreneon and its ability to bring a lot of these solutions together in a more structured way.
Yeah. Could you elaborate a little bit? You mentioned futures and power purchase agreements, or those future contracts for renewable energy were a huge part of the unlock for private capital into the renewable energy space. And Creneon is replicating that model with something we call virtual water purchase agreements. Would you mind explaining for someone who doesn't live and breathe banking every day how power purchase agreements or virtual water purchase agreements help from a banking perspective lower the risk?
Sure. I mean, think of it as these power purchase agreement prices essentially becomes your cash flow, right? So, for example, it's a 15-year project, or a 25-year project, and you are, buying power, or selling power at, let's say, $50 per megawatt, right? You sort of like take that number, and put it on your monthly or yearly cash flows, and model out and say, okay, based on everything that I'm paying for, or I'm purchasing this power, or selling this power, and then sort of like taking that and saying, okay, based on all the benefits that I'm getting from ITC point of view, PTC point of view, X amount of money is what my profit is, right? So that sort of like helps you to say, okay, whether a project will have an X amount of IRR versus not, and should be levered, should be unlevered, and that sort of like helps you to model out and say, whether this particular project based on when the sun is shining, or when, based on the seasonality, will produce X amount of power in a certain place, right? So that all of that goes as part of your modeling exercise, and then you say, okay, should we, as a even as a private equity firm, even as a bank, should we invest in certain kind of projects or not, right? So essentially, you are making your uh, project profitability decision based on some of that cash flows, right?
Yeah.
That's similar. I do see a similar synergy with where the water purchase agreement that we are talking about here, to say, based on, looking at the historical data in certain place, X amount of water was being created by, let's say, upstream, or let's say a water table, and then you sort of like take that and say, okay, now I can model it out and say, what my future cash flows would look like for any kind of a, project finance investments that I want to make, right? So that to me, as I mentioned previously, is sort of like enabler to say, there's a market gap for this kind of solution that could be used to make certain financial decisions for making investment in the sector. So that's how I see about, like, how water purchase agreements will have the synergies with the PPAs, and then can be used to make your purchase power decisions as well.
Yeah. It's kind of like going into the mortgage broker. You're trying to buy a house and you're saying, like, hey, I'm trying to buy this 4-bedroom home and I've got 10-year rental agreements for 3 of the bedrooms. Can I get a loan? And people are gonna be like, yeah. That's a pretty good deal. Yeah, no, it definitely helps with the risk, lowering the risk, right, and helping the finance terms get actually executed.
Yeah, and
Um,
when you think about from a financial investment standpoint, right? Most of the decision is regarding, am I going to lose money on this particular project, and are my investors going to lose money, or even from a bank standpoint, are we going to have issues uh, with stranded assets, or not being able to produce what we said we'll be able to produce, right? So it's all risk mitigation strategies, and having a platform like Kreneon sort of like helps you to take that one step further and say, okay, we have looked at historical data, we have this particular data which existed, which didn't exist before, and then it helps you to make that sort of like decision go forward as well, right? So, which is much more mature decisioning, much more informed decisioning, right? So that's the word that I would use in terms of like how the risk mitigation would flow out here.
Yeah, so we're going to switch tracks just a little bit. You've vetted plenty of startup founders pitching world-changing ideas. You and Mike have a relationship that goes back some time. What is it about Kreneon's team, including our advisory team, that got you excited? Because you've been at the table with us since the very beginning, helping us build this thing. So I'm curious about your experience with this organization and why you're in.
Sure. I mean, yeah, you're right. Mike and I go long, long back. One of the things that stood to me, and is the team's ability, or the team's understanding of the space, right? So you have Stan, who has done this for many, many years, for many, many years in his previous role with Enron, and you are here in this shoes, wearing multiple hats, and you come from a very reputed organization of Intel, right? And you've done this before, even with something else. So I think I saw that maturity in terms of the team, that understanding of the space, of how to run this professionally, and even thinking from, how do we go to the investors, or how do we think about, from a compliance standpoint, how do we think about international markets, where do we put this company geographically. So from all of that, I can tell you, it's not a startup which is run by like 24 years old. It's a startup run by much more mature group of professionals who have done this before, who know what it takes to make it successful, and then go in the right direction. So I think all of that combination is something that drove me towards the company, as well as just being part of the advisory team, in terms of helping Mike, in terms of thinking about some of the roadmap as well as some of the structures behind the company. And then, again, going back to my previous point of, do we have something like this in the space? And my answer was like, okay, we are filling out a gap, right? So even evaluating with other founders in my current role as advisor for some of these firms, one of the questions I ask is, what kind of a gap are we filling to, right? So that determines you to say, okay, how do we do the pricing? How do we, engage with investors? And in terms of Kreneon, that's where I saw, there's a niche gap that the company's ideas were trying to fill, and with the whole mature team who has done this before. So I think those combination, or the pot of all the things coming together, drove me towards the Kreneon, to be part of the team.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, we're very delighted to have you as part of our team as well. So you have had a front seat view, probably more so than many of us, on the impact of renewable energy credits, registries, standardized contract formation, and the dramatic increase in trillions of dollars of investment that drove in solar and wind. I'm curious, if you're sitting, 2030, 35, 2040, what do you think our world's going to look like after Kreneon has been successful and scaled private capital into water?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, as soon as this idea was brought up by Mike and the team, my first analogy directly went into the Rex and carbon credit, and I said, okay, this is very, similar idea to Rex and carbon credit. And in my role with consulting for utilities as well as from banking standpoint, I saw some of those kind of products help in enabling more investment flowing into the sector, right? So utilities had to voluntary, and then from a compliance standpoint, purchase this Rex and carbon credits, right? That sort of like drove investment towards the space, and said, it's enabling an investment in the space which was risky at times, and we are talking about almost a decade and a half ago, where the traditional investment was not flowing. So these kind of products helped in enabling more mature capital flow towards the space as well, right? You had big companies like Google's and Amazon buying Rex and carbon credits for people who are developing these kind of assets on the ground, right? So this sort of like helped the sector to become more mature in terms of having a buyer on the other side, not only for the purchase power agreement, but also for these ancillary products that came around, in the space. That sort of like validated for a lot of the finance risk team is this sector is being viewed in much more mature way. That's the synergy that I see from the water side as well. To see if some of these registries are, if they are non existent, and if we can come up with some of the products in the space, that helps to have much more mature capital to think about the space in a very different way than what it has been traditionally viewed as, right? So that's how I see more, again, going back to my keyword of like, it enables more investment in the space because of the maturity that comes around, right? So
Yeah.
that's how I see, the funds flowing into space, as well as people being aware about the registry and about the infrastructure as well.
Wonderful. Well, I'm looking forward to that day. Well, thank you so much for joining us on Unfiltered at the Water Cooler. Is there anything else you'd like to add in closing before we wrap?
I mean, I'm very excited to be part of the advisory team, and I've seen how the ideas have come together in a much more structured and a meaningful way. Again, a long way to go, but it's something where when I discuss these ideas with some of my contacts in the space, who are always looking at great ideas, most of them are like, we don't have anything like that in the space, right? So how do we like make it more formal? So I think it's a very niche space. And especially like one of the going back to my first question that you asked about my trip in India. One of the big billionaire out in India, he said water is the new gold, right? It's not oil, it's not data. Water is a new gold, right? So as we see more investments flowing around because of the climate change, because of everything that AI is demanding, having a platform like Kreneon, it just enables a different kind of a thinking of how do you fill up this niche gap, right? So I'm very excited about the space. I do think as I talk to more people about water infrastructure, as I spread my wings in the space, I do see eyes rolling around like, oh, wait a minute, we like the space, we like how the space is coming around. So I do think it's an exciting future for the water infrastructure space as an asset class. So
Yeah,
that's how I would leave it.
perfect. Yeah, I think the most common question I get is, wait, this doesn't already exist? And then the second most common question is, how fast can you build it? Like, how soon till I can use it? And so it is a very dynamic and important space. I agree. Well, thank you so much, Laksh, for joining us, and we will talk soon. Take care. Bye.
Like I said, thanks for inviting.